Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us. For those I haven't met, my name is Gary Wasden. I'm the Executive Director of the Leather Archives and Museum in Chicago. And we are very happy to be here today on our third of the Leather Legacy series that we are doing each Thursday at 2 p.m. Central to connect with community leaders, authors, scholars who are doing work in the fields of leather, kink, fetish, and BDSM, and a wonderful way also to connect with each other and spend a little time together while we are all quarantined or in isolation in various states around the world. So thanks for spending some time with us today. I'll share just a few quick things as we get started here. First, if you've missed our first two episodes, they are available on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/leatherarchives. So you can check those out as you wish when we're done here today. As I've mentioned, we are recording this. The recording only captures the spotlight video, so it only captures myself and David, our speaker. However, you're welcome to turn your video camera off if you wish, just in an abundance of caution for your own privacy. You're welcome to do that. You can also change your name if you wish by using the rename feature, which is in the participant list there. But again, the video only captures myself and David. Just to help with the flow of this, we do keep everyone muted, so it'll just be David talking throughout the presentation. As you have questions and things you want to ask, you're welcome to use the chat feature at any time. You don't have to wait until the end to type your question and do it while it's fresh in your mind. Just type that into the chat window, and when David's finished with his presentation, I'll read out the questions to him so we can initiate a little back and forth there in the discussion. So thanks again. With that, let's get started. We're really happy today to have David K. Johnson here with us. David's a professor down at the University of South Florida. Many of us probably first became aware of David with his book, The Lavender Scare, which was made into a documentary which won numerous awards at film festivals around the world and was broadcast on PBS back in 2019, I believe. David, in addition to that, though, has published a more recent book that we're talking about here today, Buying Gay, which was the result of many years of research, including some time he spent with us here at the Leather Archives and Museums as one of our visiting scholars. I'm really excited to announce, right before we started, David shared with me a little bit of breaking news. The book, Buying Gay, was just given an award as the best book in postal history. And you, like I, may not know that there is an award for books on postal history, but pretty exciting for this to win. And as we were talking, you know, it's actually kind of an important factor to think about this book winning a Postal History Award, because if you've read Buying Gay, you know that the Postal Service in most ways is the essential villain in this story of persecution and prosecution against the people who were producing the Physique magazine. So very interesting for that to come full circle, and many congratulations to David on this big award. So with that, I'm really happy to turn this over to David. He'll be talking. He also has a PowerPoint that he'll be sharing with us that has some of the images of what he's talking about. So it's going to take me just a second here, but I'm going to switch us over to David and take it away. You should be on.
Hey everybody, thanks Gary. Can you hear me all right? Awesome, terrific. Happy to be here. Thanks to Gary, thanks to the Leather Archives, which is near and dear to my heart, because as Gary said, I spent some time there as a visiting scholar. That was one of the first grants that I got, one of the first stops that I made when I started this research many years ago. It's also I think the sexiest line on my CV is that scholarship program. So I just wanted to start out by telling you how I got interested in this story and how it developed, and then share with you stories about 3 of the Physique magazines, really the men behind them, the Physique Entrepreneurs that started them. So I discovered Physique magazines when researching the Lavender Scare long ago, and discovered that lots of gay men considered them very important to the community. Certainly the gay press considered them important and had lots of odes to Tom of Finland and Bob Mizer and others. I knew that the art houses made all of these very expensive coffee table books about physique magazines, right? Tom of Finland got his own foundation, a couple of clothing lines. The gay public seemed to take these physique magazines very seriously. But I also noticed that my academic colleagues in LGBT studies and the history of sexuality didn't really pay much attention to them. Either they often just ignored them, or if they did talk about them, they talked about them often with a certain disdain. They saw in these physique magazines evidence of the closet, people hiding behind the field of bodybuilding. They saw self-loathing. They sometimes saw racism, because a lot of the images were, of course, of white men. So I saw this kind of disconnect between a popular appreciation of physique magazines from the 50s and 60s and this academic dismissal. So as an academic historian, I wanted to investigate this and see what was up. And so I traveled all around the country, Leather Archives in Chicago, the Kinsey Institute in Indiana, LGBT archives like the One Center in Los Angeles, the one in San Francisco, the New York Public Library, all over, right? And here I'm going to try to start my PowerPoint. Oh, yeah, down here. And tell you a little bit about what I discovered in the process of researching this. Oops. Okay. There are just some examples, right? There were so many. There are, I don't know, probably 20 or 30 different physique magazines at different times throughout the 50s and 60s. But what I discovered was that these magazines were central to a whole generation of gay men's sense of coming out and self-discovery. It was often their first contact with gay culture and with homoerotic desire. Any gay man that you talk to that's over, I don't know, about 70 years old can vividly remember the first time he saw a physique magazine on one of the nation's newsstands. Michael Denneny, for example, remembers when he was walking up the main street in downtown Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where he was from, and he saw this cover, excuse me, of Physique Pictorial, the first image of Tom of Finland. He said it pierced him to the soul, right? He understood that this was an image in a magazine meant for him, right, as a young gay boy. And the thing about these was they were available all over the country, right? It wasn't just New York and San Francisco, where these were available. Because of the structures of capitalism, if a magazine got picked up by one of the large magazine distributors, all of the newsstands in the country had to take it, right? So you could be in New York City, you could be in South Dakota, you could be in Tampa, Florida, and you would find these on your newsstands. In this image from 1957, you can see in the upper left-hand corner, just above the news seller's head, is one magazine, and also there's a lot of Finland. That was sort of the homosexual magazine, right? Section of the newsstand, and this was pretty typical. And if you, for some reason, didn't see it on your newsstand, right, you could subscribe to these and get it through the mail, right, in an envelope like this. I like to describe the U.S. Postal Service as the internet of the 1950s and 60s, right? It really connected people and connected the people who enjoyed these physique magazines. I also learned not only these were important to a lot of gay men, but that, and they were available everywhere, but everybody knew that they were gay, right? They weren't hiding behind everything, behind anything. Judges who ruled about their obscenity knew they were gay magazines. Tabloid magazines like Rave and all kinds of others ran these exposés about, you know, who pins up the pinup boys, revealing that, of course, it wasn't women who were buying these, right? It was other men. And, you know, what did that mean? That this was some sort of, you know, decline in American morality. And certainly the post office was aware of this and tried to suppress them, right? So everybody knew that these were gay magazines. I also learned that physique magazines were really just the centerpiece of a whole, what I call a gay consumer culture network that developed in the 50s and 60s. So you could not only buy these images and these photographs and these magazines, but you could buy books through gay book services. You could buy artwork, like some by Quentins and other physique artists. You could buy greeting cards, right, from DSI out of Minneapolis. You could buy clothing from catalogs like Amen out of Los Angeles, one of the first gay stores in West Hollywood. Their catalogs actually looked a lot like physique magazines. A whole host of items you could buy, right? His and His towel sets, and again, all through the mail, right, through mail order. So what I determined was that what this amounted to essentially was a gay market, and the people talked about it as a gay market as early as the late 50s and early 60s. So that the idea of gay commerce and a gay market is not, in fact, a result of Stonewall or the gay liberation movement, right? But it was a catalyst to it. And so I argue that this period of the 50s and 60s that we often think of as or call the homophile movement, because of the small political organizations that were forming at the time, right? The Mattachine Society in Los Angeles, One, and the Daughters of Bilitis. Those were important, but their audience was tiny compared to the audience that physique magazines were reaching. So that what we ought to call this era is not the homophile era, but the physique era. Because they united gay men in a way that nothing ever had before. And of course, you know, that sense of community and union was in some ways limited. It was mostly white men. The images were largely of white men, although actually less than we think. Most of the ones that are now memorialized in, you know, Tom of Finland exhibits, those are all white. The magazines themselves were actually much more diverse, and the audience for them was actually much more diverse than we realized. Christopher Carrington, whose collection this photo comes from, was one of the physique enthusiasts and customers from Harlem, for example. So I want to talk about just 3 of the physique entrepreneurs that I chronicle. Each chapter in the book is about a different business and the people behind it. But I'm just going to talk about 3 of them today. And the first one is Bob Mizer, who I'm calling the activist. He's probably the most well-known. Probably most of you know of him. He was the most recognized at the time in the 50s and 60s, and still today the most recognized. There's a film about him. He, of course, is most famous for discovering and naming this physique artist from Finland with a very funny name, who he dubbed Tom of Finland. But the thing you should really know about Bob Mizer is that he came out very early. He came out in the 40s when he was in high school in Los Angeles. He hung around Pershing Square, which is in downtown Los Angeles. It was a big gay cruising area. He developed a circle of friends there. a real, very developed social life. And it's there that he learned about physique photography and started interning with one of the local physique photographers. Then he got his own camera. He started going to Muscle Beach, taking photographs. Around the corner from Pershing Square was another important place for Bob Mizer, and that was the LA City Library. And every week, for most of his life, he would make weekly trips to the LA Library, taking out all kinds of books. He was a voracious reader, very smart, industrious man. And he was a writer. Actually, even in high school, he was a writer. He had written for his local award-winning high school paper. And his goal in life was to be a writer. He wanted to write a book, and he even said in his diary, he wanted to write a book that would help the homosexualists, which was one of the words he used for gay men. He wanted to help the community that he had discovered at Pershing Square through his writing. And although he never wrote a book, that is essentially what he did in writing all of the feisty editorials that he did in his magazine, Physique Pictorial. This is a picture from his high school yearbook. Bob Mizer is the handsome man right in the center in the back, the tall one. Right, he wanted to be a writer, and he succeeded really in that, in creating a book, really actually a magazine, right, that would help other gay men, right, have a sense of hope. He started out by sending in his photographs to what I call the mainstream bodybuilding magazines at the time, Strength and Health and Iron Man. And he was pretty successful getting his photos published there. And then he started putting ads in the back, as you see here on the right, an ad for his company, Athletic Model Guild, which offered these photographs, sometimes nude photographs, figure studies, they were often called, incredibly popular, made a lot of money at it. But it also caught the attention of the post office, who pressured Strength and Health to stop using AMC's ads. But they basically tried to push Bob Mizer and other gay physique photographers out of the mainstream bodybuilding magazines. So Bob Mizer's response, right, because he was a fighter, he was an activist, was to create his own magazine, Physique Pictorial. So it's important to realize that right from the very beginning, the first physique magazine in 1951 was a response to this attempted crackdown by the post office. And the whole rest of the history of physique magazines is basically a struggle with the post office. The other way in which Strength and Health was important to Bob Mizer is that it had what was known as the Leaguers column. It was basically like a pen pal classified ad section. And Bob Mizer early on put in an ad into the Leaguers section. It's actually the one on the very top here, if you can see it. It says, Leaguer Bob Mizer gives his address, which remained his address for the rest of his life. But it said he was interested in corresponding with others and exchanging photographs. That's basically all it said. And he got 300 responses from this ad he placed. I think it's in the 1940s. Right? So he learned from this that there was this hunger out there for gay men to connect, right, through things like Strength and Health, which led him in 1951 to found Physique Pictorial, as he's pushed out by the mainstream bodybuilding magazines. It started as a collective effort. There were actually 4 other physique photographers involved in it. The other 4 eventually dropped out. They were scared of what the post office's reaction would be. But Bob Mizer was relentless, and he kept publishing it for the next 20 years, basically. And it acted as a sort of better business bureau. He gave all of these notices when new physique photographers came on the market, when new magazines came around. If there was a crackdown, he would warn readers about that. His editorials included notions of arguments about censorship. He would ask people to join the ACLU, to go to the Mattachine Society and get information. So it really was this kind of central news network that he created. He's also yes, this is one of the images. I mean, that men talked about how his magazine gave them, hope that there was a sort of a place for them. This very positive view of homoerotic camaraderie, usually around his backyard pool, right? But as with all of these, right, the post office was also aware of this. He was arrested. Mizer was arrested twice for different charges involving obscenity. He spent some time in jail, but he came out after each entanglement with the law even more determined, right, to keep this business going and to keep this kind of lifeline to gay men across the country and across the world going, which is why I call him an activist and a pioneer. And all of these physique photographers in many ways were, but Bob Mizer perhaps even more than others. The second magazine and set of entrepreneurs I want to talk about is the Grecian Guild Pictorial, which launches in 1955, right, a few years later, by two gentlemen, Randolph Benson and John Bullock, who are two people I'm willing to bet my house that you've never heard of before. I don't think anyone has written a single word about these two gentlemen before buying gay. But I call them the fraternal organizers. And what I love about the story of the Grecian Guild and these two guys is that at the center of it is a love story. These guys met in 1947 at the University of Virginia. Randolph Benson was slightly older. He was a graduate student in sociology at the University of Virginia. And then one day, John Bullock appeared. I think the story goes that it was in the gym that they met. Of course, this younger freshman appeared, and both of them were white Southern gentlemen from fairly middle or upper class families in rural Virginia and North Carolina. And it was at UVA that they encountered a kind of classical education. They learned about ancient Greece. They read stories about ancient Greece. They learned about the tradition of the manly Greek warriors and their relationships with younger men. And they seem to have embraced that also even in their personal life, with Randolph Benson being kind of the older Erinomus and John Bullock being the younger Erastes. Randolph Benson would become the business manager of Grecian Guild Pictorial, and his partner, John, would be the artistic director and, as you can see here, sometime model as well. Their idea of a kind of homoerotic Greek past was in many ways nothing new. There were lots of 19th century literary figures, gay men who talked and invoked ancient Greece as a way to kind of normalize their interest in other men. This photograph by William von Gluten from the 19th century, right, is part of that. But this was a kind of, elite providence in the 19th century. What's unique about the Grecian Guild and these guys is that they take this kind of homoerotic Hellenism, this long-standing 19th century tradition, and they give it a mass market, right? They're selling, 40,000 copies of issues of the Grecian Guild with images of the Roman baths by Quintence. Right, so they're giving this a mass audience. Their magazine, the Grecian Guild, was a kind of call for a return to this, to the values of ancient Greece, right? Where they said the body of a beautiful young boy was considered one of the most beautiful of all things. So they really had a kind of vision of the future that involved examining the past, which of course as a historian I appreciate. They, like Bob Mizer, saw this hunger for connection amongst their friends and colleagues. And they took it a step further than Bob Mizer. They were going to not actually create just a virtual community through the mails and the newsstands. They created a gay fraternal order, right? They called it the Grecian Guild. And you could get a certificate of membership, right? Like this one. If you joined, if you paid a few more dollars, you could buy a pin, which you could wear in public, right? To announce, right? To anyone you saw, you know, in a cruising area that you were a member of the Grecian Guild. They had chaplains, all kinds of the trappings of a regular fraternity, a fraternal order. They indeed tried to have regional conventions, right? So people could actually come together and socialize and meet each other. They did manage to have, I believe, 3 of these. They had one in San Francisco, one in St. Louis, and one in New Orleans. They didn't have huge numbers of attendance. This one says there were 35 at the convention in San Francisco in 1959, right? But it shows this attempt, right, to create community through these images and these magazines. And Grecian brothers were encouraged not only to come to the regional conventions, but then return home and to found local chapters. And we know at least one of them was successful. There was a local chapter in Minneapolis of the Grecian Guild. And records show that at least one of the members drove like 200 miles every time they went to a meeting. Right? So you could, as I said, you could be anywhere. You could be in the smallest town and be connected to this sense of community. They also, Grecian Guild published images of Grecian fraternity members, and they would also publish their addresses so that you could correspond with them, right? Sort of an early version of a gay pen pal club, which is one reason the post office, I believe, also slowly pushed them out of the business, which is why you've probably never heard of them. They sold the business. They moved back to Virginia. They became teachers. And they retired, as one does, to St. Petersburg, Florida. And John Bullock and Randolph Benson died within 2 weeks of each other, as long-term partners often do, in 2006, which was just about the time I was starting this research. So I did not get to meet them, sadly, even though we lived about 40 minutes away from each other. They are buried next to each other in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the town where they met in 1947. Right, so at the center of the Grecian Guild pictorial is this amazing love story and partnership. And the third physique entrepreneur I want to talk to you about is one I'm sure you all have heard about. Right, Chuck Renslow. He's also the only one of the 3 that I actually got to meet. I got to interview him at one of the IML events, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. I'm happy to say he pinched my ass. So I got propositioned by Chuck Renslow. It's one of my claims to fame. But what you may not know, right, is that I call him the businessman. Of course he was, but you may not know that he got his business start as a physique photographer, right? In 1952, he founds Chris Studios. In Chicago. This is some of their images. His partner, both romantic and business partner, Domingo Oriudos, was also a physique artist, right, who was already publishing some of his artwork in Tomorrow's Man, which was also published out of Chicago. And of course, the issue for all of these guys was, where do you find models? You need models to create these magazines and these photographs. For Bob Mizer, right, he went to Muscle Beach. He's in Los Angeles. He's got lots of material. The Grecian Guild, they first use actually students at the University of Virginia as their early models. Chuck Renslow gets involved in the AAU competitions, the bodybuilding competitions in Chicago, and finds models there, right? But as a businessman, he actually buys a gym. He buys Irv Johnson's gym in downtown Chicago as a way of encouraging bodybuilders to model for his magazine. He also makes connections with Lynn Womack in Washington, D.C., the physique photographer, not photographer, publisher really, who establishes the biggest empire. He has 6 or 8 physique magazines in his business, and because of that, he has enough money and wherewithal to actually fight the post office and win a victory at the Supreme Court. But he sponsors a lot of local photographers, including Chuck Renslow. He sponsors Chuck Renslow's Mars magazine, which had obviously a leather and, as they called it then, a leather and Levi specialization. Right? By 1963, 64, there's so many physique magazines that they're specializing, right? And Mars is the leather one. He, of course, is also rated. Chris Studios, twice rated, once in 1958, once in 1967, which were both periods of national crackdowns by the post office and by local district attorneys. But unlike a lot of them, so Bob Mizer goes to jail because of this. The Grecian Guild folks are pushed out of the business. Chuck Renslow's response is different, right? Probably because he had lots of contacts in Chicago and with the political machine. He probably paid someone off. We don't really know. But his charges get dropped. It may also have been because of his contacts with Lynn Womack, who had lots of attorneys and a legal library. But for whatever reason, he doesn't go to jail. He survives in the business as a physique photographer, and he diversifies. So not only does he buy a gym, later on he opens the Gold Coast. He opens one of the first leather bars in the country, decorates it with his lover Dom's physique artwork, and they hold Thursday night spaghetti dinners and Sunday nights movie nights, and it becomes this great community center in Chicago for gay men, and particularly, of course, for the leather community. And it's there that he holds the first Mr. Gold Coast, right, competition by about 1968, which was a phenomenon that obviously drew on bodybuilding competitions and had its roots in the physique world and the bodybuilding world. But by the time it's a Mr. Gold Coast competition, right, it's openly gay. And there were actually a proliferation in the late 60s of these kind of gay beauty pageant competitions. All of the magazines by the 60s and 70s have these. So David magazine, which was from the South, had a Mr. David contest. The Advocate in Los Angeles, which starts in 67, had a Groovy Guy contest. The Gold Coast had the Mr. Gold Coast competition. And it's that one, right, the Mr. Gold Coast, which became, of course, IML, which is the only one, as far as I know, that's still around, right? Another example, right, of how Chuck Renslow, as an early physique photographer, was more successful than anyone else at creating and sustaining the sense of community. All of them tried to do this. Bob Mizer and Benson and Bullock and a lot of other ones. They tried to create community. They tried to create pen pal clubs. And most of them were shut down in one way or another by the post office. But Chuck Renslow is one of the few who succeeds. and not only succeeds economically, but manages to translate that economic clout into political clout, which is what all of them really ultimately wanted, right? So Chuck Renslow founded the Prairie State Democrats. He, as an owner of the gay newspaper in Chicago, he's influential with Jane Byrne. He gets her to sign an executive order barring anti-gay discrimination in city hiring, right? So he's really the success story here. He's what all of the other ones in many ways aspired to do, right? And he demonstrates this connection between economic power and political clout. And I think it was sort of the way it had to develop. Gay men could not imagine themselves even having political power until they saw how they could have economic power. Once they saw that they were a market, they realized that could translate into other realms. And that's also in many ways the story, I think, of Harvey Milk, right? It was in Castro Camera Store, this camera store in San Francisco, that Harvey Milk, right, becomes this important political figure in San Francisco, and really the most prominent gay political figure in the country, right, until he's assassinated. And I always kind of wondered, like, camera store, Castro Camera, it seems sort of random, right? Like, why does that become a social center and really a political center in gay San Francisco? But in doing research for Buying Gay, I think I figured out why. Because it turns out, although it's called Castro Camera, they didn't actually sell cameras. Castro Camera was a film developing store, right? Where gay men in the Castro could come and get their film, much of it, right, homoerotic, or at least considered, potentially obscene by the powers that be. They could get it developed there and not have any problem with that. That had been a problem throughout this period, this physique period of the 50s and 60s, right? Gay men, where are you going to get your film developed? It's why a lot of gay men in the 50s and 60s had the hobby of film developing, or they would buy Polaroid cameras. The Polaroid camera was a huge innovation for gay men, right? Because it got around this issue of finding a safe place to develop your film. And so I think that's one of the reasons why Castro Camera became such a hotbed of community formation and political activism in San Francisco. Because as with Bob Mizer and as with Chris Studios, as with the Grecian Guild, right, in all of these venues, it was the business of producing and distributing these homoerotic images that helped form community and ultimately helped form a movement. And that's Buying Gay. And I would be happy and delighted to talk about it and answer some questions.
Thanks, David. That was fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we have a few questions submitted already, so let me share those with you here. Back towards the beginning, you showed the image of the newsstand, and we're showing the Physique magazines, and I think the one magazine that was on the newsstand. Do you know where that newsstand image was from?
I do. It's from, it's basically Times Square. I think it's 1957. It appeared in a story, actually there's a story that came out just a few years ago on the occasion of the anniversary of, it was the 50th anniversary of Sports Illustrated. So it was just a random image of a newsstand. The guy is actually reading, I'd have to go through them all to get to it here, but he's actually reading Sports Illustrated. But I happened to notice up in the corner, right, were all of the gay magazines.
Fascinating. Let's see, sorry, I'm just scrolling through here looking at people's questions. So we talked a lot. You talked, about the audience for these, and the very sort of clear knowledge that these were being produced for a gay male audience. Do we know, for the magazines in particular, is there any way that we would know that it was only men who were reading them? Do you have any sense of if there were female readers, if there was a female readership for them?
Yeah, we don't really know. There was one account that I remember, forgetting where it was from now, that it may have been from the Kinsey Institute, which Kinsey had a correspondence with almost all of these physique photographers. He kept some of their records. That some small percentage, maybe 20%, were, or at least purchased by women, which we don't even know, who's actually reading them. But the only place in the story where women really appear is in the book clubs. There were lots of gay mail order book clubs. One started by Donald Webster Corey, the first one actually in the 1950s. The Daughters of Bilitis also had a book club, and there was of course lots of lesbian pulp fiction.
Right.
But that's really the only place that I unfortunately see women in this story. I mean, it's a commercial market, right? So it's based on money and income, and therefore I think this happened in the gay male community long before it happened in the lesbian community.
Sure.
Lesbians start publishing their own magazines, as far as I know, in the 80s. Things like desktop publishing, and it becomes a lot
Right.
cheaper to do it.
Right. Next question. First, a comment thanking you for this fabulous work. And the question, did you run into any information about the arrest and incarceration of Bob Milne for possession of some gayish art?
I'm sorry, what was the name?
Bob Milne, M-I-L-N-E?
No.
Ring a bell? No?
No.
Okay.
I mean, almost every physique photographer that I'm aware of had some, run-in
Right.
with the law and the post office.
Yeah, for sure. Here's the next one. Thanks again for the great talk. How did physique magazines and publishers respond to the Roth decision, or how were they affected by the Roth decision?
Wow, that's a very knowledge. Someone knows their censorship history. The Roth decision, let's see if I get this right, was in 1957. It was essentially a liberalization of censorship regulations in the country. It was certainly seen as a liberalization. And since about 1957 on, almost all of the Supreme Court decisions basically found whatever was before them to be not obscene, including One magazine and Lynn Womack's magazines like Manual. But the interesting part of this is that although the physique photographers were thrilled with this, and there's actually an uptick in publication after 1957, it's seen as a kind of green light. The post office did not agree with the Supreme Court, and the postal the head of the post office, Arthur Summerfield, that's when he institutes a crackdown. It's in 1958 that he institutes a crackdown directly in response to Roth. He's basically saying, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I'm going to enforce what I see as the obscenity laws going back to the Comstock law of the 1870s. So yeah, that's where the conflict happens.
Sure. Next comment, again from someone who read and loved your book, commented that they were surprised by the fact that ministers appeared in them in posing straps and collars. How common was this gay minister connection?
Yes, that's, as far as I know, it's limited to the Grecian Guild. That was a phenomenon pretty much that just happened in the Grecian Guild magazine because it thought of itself as a fraternity. They had, I think that was a kind of fraternal tradition, right, to have a chaplain. And they, I don't know, the founders were good Southern gentlemen who were from, I think one was from a Methodist background and one was from an Episcopalian background. And they brought in ministers, including Robert Wood, who would go on to write Christ and the Homosexual, one of the first positive books about gays and Christian faith.
Right. So
yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. I enjoyed writing that. I often, we LGBT historians and historians of sexuality, historians generally, get criticized for not talking about religion. And so I'm glad that I was able to talk about these topics.
From Jake here, fascinating work, David. Thank you. Did the 1958 Supreme Court decision that allowed for the distribution of one magazine through the mail have any consequences for the distribution of Physique magazines?
Kind of, yes. It was also seen as a kind of green light, or a positive event in this struggle with the post office. But it wasn't. I don't think wasn't nearly as important as it's become and seen by historians of the homophile movement. They tend to focus on that decision, the one decision. And it was the first one. But it was, there were actually no oral arguments in that case. It was just a decision, a one sentence decision handed down by the Supreme Court. The Manuel V. Day decision, which was about Lynn Womack's case, which was specifically about Physique magazines, was actually more important. There were oral arguments in it. It was the very first time gay rights were argued before the Supreme Court. It was arguing about the right for men to read Physique magazines. So I argue that Manuel V. Day was actually more important.
Right.
But they did kind of build on each other.
This next one's more of a comment in relation to the conversation from earlier about is there any evidence of women reading the magazine. Someone commented that in one of the news articles that you clipped and shared, it noted that there were 1,000 names on a mailing list and only one that was obviously feminine.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Now that I'm remembering, the source, the one where it suggested it could have been like 20% was it wasn't Physique magazines. It was one of the one of the book services. It was Greenberg Publishers, which established one of the first gay mailing lists for their gay interest books. So those had more women, as I said, right? It was the book clubs where there were women, but probably not the magazines.
As you were kind of noting earlier, these magazines were, known for, their target audience of a gay male audience. And given that it was, recognized, how would a man in a small town buy a copy without being outed?
Really good question. From all accounts that I've heard, the most common method was to steal it. A lot of them were very small. These magazines were really small, especially Grecian Guild. So they would take it, put it inside another magazine, and buy the other magazine and hope that nobody noticed. Which I think is really interesting because it suggests they were more willing to get caught for stealing, right, than for openly buying what was everyone knew was really a gay magazine.
Yeah.
So stealing, I think, was very common.
Yeah, I have to say, as a son of a Southern Baptist minister, and that was my experience as a young man as well. Stealing, I could explain away. The rest, not so much.
and I have a little evidence that I think they knew that, and I think that's why they kept them small.
Yeah.
Because it facilitated, and they didn't care. The company got paid either way, whether it was or not.
Next question, thinking specifically about the models during this time, the men who were photographed during this time. Were there ever magazines that published, or any of the magazines that published, did they feature men who were more effeminate in nature, more slender, or were they exclusively the more sort of bodybuilder, muscular men?
Yeah, no, great question. The answer is yes. They did feature a variety of body types. I mean, it depends on which magazine you're talking about. There was a great diversity of them, but generally, yes. In fact, that was one of the things that characterized them, was that they weren't just bodybuilders. They got derided by the mainstream bodybuilding magazines, right, for featuring, what they considered to be emaciated bodies. So they did offer kind of a diversity of body images, and that's kind of what made them different. What made them gay, really.
Right.
And we don't really know that, because all of the images we see now are the ones that are in exhibits and coffee table books, and are the most buff and and appealing in a kind of conventional sense. But if you go through all of the physique magazines, there's actually much more diversity than you would imagine.
Thanks. This next one, it's a little long here. So the core of the question is, did you find any intersections between physique pictorials distributed in the US with that of Blue Books, the Tijuana Bibles, as far as issues with the US Postal Service? Goes on to say, it seems like a lot of the legal crackdowns on physique pictorials also crossed into illustrations, erotic comics. For the Blue Books, they likely didn't have the same distribution systems as the pictorial magazines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know much about the Blue Books. The Blue Books, I believe, were earlier. Maybe not. I think a little earlier than the physique magazines. No, the artistic images often, yes, were often considered more, salacious, obscene, revealing than the actual photographs.
Right.
Got them in more trouble.
Hmm.
I will just say I don't know a lot about the international aspects to this. There certainly could have been a whole international section, because it did, in fact, right. This is circulating through the mails. This is not just a national, but an international community that's being established. But I wanted it to be a finished book, so I didn't really go into the international aspect of it.
Right. Sure.
And they are different, all different legal systems, and so.
Good. I have one comment just to add to what we were talking about earlier about lesbian publications, and just a note about the fact that lesbian publications did exist significantly prior to the 1980s. There was a surge of them in the 70s.
Okay.
Let's see.
So, okay.
This comment, be interesting to hear if you've looked at this, because I know as a writer, this is something we often check. Do you have a sense that many public libraries have been purchasing Buying Gay and have it in their collections?
I think so. I think
Have you not checked WorldCat? I always thought first thing authors do is look at WorldCat. Let's see where my book is.
I have perused WorldCat. I haven't checked it lately, but yeah, I think it's doing well.
Yeah. After it first came out, I checked just to kind of see, and it was, certainly snatched up by most of the, urban public library systems quickly. So I'm sure it is. Next question is, I'm a teacher for a high school in Minneapolis. I'm teaching our first gender studies class for the state. Congratulations. I would be remiss not to include something about the leather community. What would you want students to know about the community and its activist work?
What would I want students to know about the community and its activist work? Well, I think to know about this, the struggles that it's gone through, right? That it was a community that was being actively repressed, right, by the government, by local police officials, right? So this is. And the connection to Minneapolis is interesting. There's a whole chapter in the book, I didn't talk about it here, but of one of the final and largest physique, I call it an empire actually, was headquartered in Minneapolis.
Right.
It's one of the crazy things, right? You could be anywhere, right? You didn't have to be in New York or San Francisco. So DSI, Directory Services Incorporated, was headquartered in Minneapolis. According to their attorney, in the 1960s, they were the largest customer at the downtown Minneapolis post office. They were making millions of dollars. They had 13 full-time employees in the 1960s, just putting out, magazines and pamphlets and catalogs. So there's a rich physique history in Minneapolis to talk about.
That's awesome. We're going to wrap up here. I'll read a few more last comments, but before I do, I'm going to be really selfish and just say for the person who's working on this class in Minneapolis, please reach out to me at the Leather Archives. I would love to talk to you because we're actually working on this. Our archives in the museum itself are actually only open to people over the age of 18, but I've actually been working on some sort of curriculum that could be used in classroom settings exactly along the lines of what you're doing. So I'd love to talk to you about that. So sorry to insert myself in here a little bit. Just a few last comments shared here. One was to point out that Blue Books ran, as we were talking earlier, primarily from the 1920s to the 1960s, and also a mention of the Treader collection at the University of Minnesota as an option. So
they have some of the DSI materials, in fact.
Yeah, that's amazing.
The DSI attorney who had saved some of the stuff gave it to the Trevor Project.
Right. One last question here, because it's a nice, simple yes, no. So we'll take it a minute. Do you have plans to present at Saints and Sinners in New Orleans next year?
I don't, but I've been to Saints and Sinners in the past, so that's a good idea. Thank you for that. I'll look into that.
Awesome. All right, everyone, we are out of time. Thank you so much, David. This was wonderful. I know everyone enjoyed it. There were additional comments just to tell you how much everyone appreciated it. It was fantastic, informative, and entertaining. So thanks for spending some time with us. Thank you for this book, too. I just have to say it's such a delight to see this book out. Probably more so for you, but on our side as well, we're thrilled to see it out and getting so much attention, the first of many awards, I'm sure, to come. For everyone else, thank you so much for joining us. Please join us again next Thursday. We have Heather Raquel Phillips who'll be with us next Thursday at 2 o'clock from Philadelphia. You can check that out on our social media or our website. So everyone, please take care, stay safe, be healthy, and we'll see you soon.